This is lecture 135A on the far north, the first part. I'm going to do two lectures on the far north on prehistoric North America prior to white contact, and we're going to start with Canada and the U.S. of course. Prehistoric Canada is divided into several areas based on geography, with peoples from the same region sharing cultural affinities. Three of these deal with the far north. The Arctic and Subarctic cultural areas are the ones we're going to be talking about today. Now, the Arctic area includes the Siberian and Alaskan coasts. In the U.S., from Yakutat Bay in the northern Pacific northward through the Bering Strait, and then eastward along the U.S. and Canadian Arctic coast. The islands of the Aleutian chain in both Russian territory and the U.S. are included. The Alaskan and Canadian coasts and tundra of the Yukon and Northwest Territories and the islands in the Northern Ocean make up a considerable part of what has been explored. Greenland's coast and that of eastern Canada, northern Quebec, Labrador, and Newfoundland constitute the remaining Arctic cultural area. The subarctic area lies to the south and inland regions of the Arctic area. In the east, it borders on the eastern woodland areas of Canada north of the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, except for southern Ontario and southern Quebec. In the Canadian west, it includes the northernmost parts of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, and bordering parts of the Yukon and Northwest Territories. Of course, in Alaska, it includes those parts south of the Arctic area until the southern part of Alaska that borders on the northwest coast area. Of course, these are the post-Pleistocene borders. During ice ages, Arctic tundras extended far south of what is now the subarctic. The main difference is always the position of the tree line separating the tundra and boreal forests. Ethnographically, the Arctic is the home of the Eskimos, and the subarctic is the home of the Native American Indians. In both cases, the earliest representatives belong to the Mongoloid racial subtype of Homo sapiens, and the Indians of the subarctic to the more Swadesh original linguistic group called Na-Dene of Northeast Asia, Northwest America. The Eskimo Aleut is the most Mongoloid of all the northern peoples, and the beginning of that dichotomy between Eskimos and Indians is about 5000 BP. Now, my work in northern British Columbia threw new light on the first arrivals from Asia, as we have seen in previous volumes. The essence is that there was an original crossing from Northeast Asia to Northwest America 100,000 years ago. Then there was a subsequent migration of people carrying the microblade and core culture of Northeast Asia, best defined around by 18,000 BP on Hokkaido Island by Professor Kobayashi. That stone tool tradition arrived in the Ice Mountain or Mountains Ice area of British Columbia by 9,500 BP. The Inuit people occupied the Canadian Arctic for thousands of years. That cultural area is characterized by long daylight hours with moderate temperatures during the summer. Winters are relatively cold and long. The Inuit communities were made up of between 500 and 1,000 members, with the regional band as their basic unit. Regional bands congregated during winter months with people gathering around hunting camps. The economy of the Arctic cultural area was based on sea mammal hunting. Fishing and gathering were important seasonal activities, with the traditional method based on local material. In my years as a graduate student at the Department of Archaeology of the University of Calgary, I came into association with Professor Albert Heinrich. Now, this gentleman had spent years doing field work among Eskimos of the far north. He had acculturated to them, taking a wife and producing 2 children. The latter appeared as Eskimos, but spoke the King's English, having become professors themselves. Accordingly, this experience was helpful to me in gaining empathy for these Arctic people and their world of origin. Now, as to the mode of production. We have seen in previous volumes that the theory of the domestic mode of production was developed by Chayanov's study of Russian peasant economies. Chayanov's theory predicts that there is a natural limit to peasant production in that the intensity of labor is proportional to the total needs of the household, including the ratio of consumers to workers, taxes, and debts. Their system of production was based on relatively small-scale, simple technology work groups organized around kinship, friendship, or temporary collegiality. And of course, all of this before the Great Turn of 1928-29, when Stalin collectivized agriculture. There is widespread sharing of costs, risks, benefits, and windfalls, and a variable allocation of production. Such systems are found in whale hunting. Now, the simple agricultural producer shares the characteristics of the fishing peasant in one important respect. In both cases, family members pool their resources, capital, and labor. By pooling available resources, the producer safeguards himself against the vulnerability of the farm. The productivity of fishing differs from one season to another, and the need for labor varies with season and fishing year. Now, as to white contact, one of the barriers to converting a small family operation into a business company is the difficulty in responding to vulnerability. That is because producers must simultaneously respond to the demands of the labor market. Skippers who own boats do not have to pay salaries every week. The absentee owner, in contrast, must conform to the formal demands of labor unions for immediate payments in order to keep his workers. The extent to which the simple producer is able to draw upon the labor of his family, however, varies with its composition and stage in the development cycle. The skipper owners who are the most vulnerable are those who have no sons or whose sons are too young to join them. Simple commodity production, then, is highly adaptive in times of financial difficulties. For the individual producer, it is enough to survive the year and hope for better luck next year. Therefore, many skipper owners form shareholding companies together with family members in order to prevent total loss of property in case of bankruptcy. Unlike absentee owners, the capitalists, skipper owners continue to invest when fishing ceases to be profitable, but unlike peasant fishermen, they do accumulate capital when it is possible to increase returns. Such differences in organization are likely to correlate with differences in perception of environmental problems. Although the contrast is by no means a stark one, the skipper owners are more likely than the absentee owners to define environmental conditions as problematic and to take direct collective action to redress the balance. Now, with regard to whaling in Iceland, during the feudal stage, Icelandic fishing was based on the household. In the household economy, there was always some kind of ceiling on production, as fishing efforts was limited by a series of ecological, social, and technical factors. This was not an isolated economy, however, without commerce and markets. Indeed, during much of the feudal period, surpluses were siphoned off through colonial relations. Timber and hand lines were imported, as well as other necessities, such as grain, and these could only be obtained by selling household products to colonial merchants. Colonial influence on the Icelandic economy was particularly strong from 1602 to 1787, when Danish merchants monopolized foreign trade with Icelanders. Under this system, the producers were compelled to sell their products to one particular merchant who determined the terms of trade. The right to trade with Icelanders was sold to the highest bidder at auctions in Copenhagen. Access to foreign markets was limited because of Iceland's status as a colony. People could have invested in boats, but capital accumulation was negligible due to colonial relations and restricted markets for fish. The hunting of sea mammals, particularly seals, was a significant part of the Icelandic household economy. Minke whales, however, were seldom hunted because people considered them to be good whales, sent by God to protect humans against bad species of whales. In recent decades, before the ban imposed by the International Whaling Commission, Iceland whaling has been organized based on capitalist production. Most of the whales landed in Iceland have been caught by the vessels of a single company, Hvalur, H-V-A-L-U-R. In Iceland, independent boat owners or simple product producers sustained capitalist fishing in its initial phase of development, at the beginning of the 20th century. Boat foremen often owned shares in their boats together with a local merchant or capitalist. Sometimes the foreman managed to buy capitalist shares and establish full ownership after a few years of fishing. Their sons often became crew members while other household members worked at washing and processing the catch. Despite full-scale capitalist development in some sectors of the fishing industry, capitalist relations of production never managed to fully penetrate Icelandic fishing, and the simple product producer never disappeared. In one fishing community on the southwest coast, it seems that from 1913, capitalists owned a substantial part of the local fleet, while later there was a gradual increase in fishermen ownership. Minke whaling, in particular, has always been the business of simple producers. The Minke whalers operated from several fishing communities on the northern coast. Their boats were 19 tons on the average in 1980, with crews of 2 to 3 men. After 1975, the Ministry of Fisheries regulated the number of boats with licenses issued to individual boat owners. Not only was the number of boats subject to control, there was a ceiling on the total annual catch of whales. The whalers themselves decided how to divide the total annual catch among themselves, and each boat was allocated a number of whales. Since 1989, the whalers have been organized in a national union. In the case of the simple producer, the family budget is closely tied to that of the boat, although the latter may be kept separate on paper to comply with tax laws. Usually, the whole nuclear families and some neighboring kinsfolk are engaged in production related to one boat. The wife of the skipper-owner takes most of the responsibility for running the household while the husband is working irregular hours. Furthermore, she may bait lines, prepare nets, and work in a freezing plant. The wife's earnings may be an important source of additional income, especially if the boat has not been doing well. If the skipper-owner has one or more sons interested in fishing, he may expand his business and buy a larger boat. As the sons of the skipper-owner grow older, they are likely to take over the enterprise. If the owner has several children, he may sell the boat when he quits fishing, but more often, the boat remains the property of the family. Sometimes an expanding company of shareholders is formed at this stage. This has not happened in Minke whaling, however, for 3 reasons. First, government policy restricts Minke whaling to small-scale producers with boats under 30 tons. Secondly, family enterprises often split as they expand. While brothers often pool their resources, their cooperation is usually limited to a few years. As they establish their own families, their resources and commitments become different, and consequently they are likely to have different opinions in matters of investment and maintenance. And thirdly, during fishing trips, the symmetrical relations between crewmen, who are not only brothers but also co-owners of the boat, tend to be incompatible with the authority relations between skipper and deckhands. The income and food provided by one whaleboat normally supported 4 to 5 families. The households of the crewmen consumed the products of the whale hunt, and some parts were sold directly by the whalers to local people for consumption. The rest was packaged and frozen for both domestic markets and exports to Japan, the Faroe Islands, and Norway. Minke whaling was usually a summer activity closely linked to the cod fishery during the winter. After the introduction of the whaling ban, Minke whalers have had a hard time. They have tried to compensate for the lack of income from whaling by increasing their participation in the winter fishery. This is not that easy, however. To participate in the winter fishery in rough weather on distant grounds would demand much larger boats than applicable to Minke whaling. Since 1985, the cod fishery has been strictly regulated on a quota basis, and Minke whalers are entitled to minimal quota allocation that is based on average cod catches in the past days of Minke whaling. Some have become bankrupt and lost their boats. Others have managed to survive, hoping that the ban on whaling would be lifted in the near future. The household is the focus of production efforts. Both the indigenous hunter and the simple commodity producer are involved in the cash economy, and both participate in local networks of exchange, and both are anxious to protect the stocks they have used against overexploitation. Now I want to take up three different inventions. The anthropologists Svetlana Usania Kravchuk and Nikolai Garin are ethnographers specializing in West Siberia, the Yaml Peninsula, and the polar Urals. They have written an excellent article on the core technological inventions of these Arctic peoples, and that summary appeared in the 9 May 2017 issue of Technology Stories, published by the Society for the History of Technology. These accounts give an aesthetic flavor for the core technological artifacts and clothing of Arctic peoples. These inventions are 1. The child's cradle, 2. A man's utility belt, and 3. A woman's needlework case. Taking the first one, the child's cradle. A baby cradle, or APA, APA, is a micro-scale mobile house for the Arctic baby. The infant is weatherproofed for all seasons. The APA resembles the shape of a modern baby carriage. Protection from the wind is the essential design feature that determines what material elements are taken from the tundra environment for its construction. The APA is made of thin, light birch slats with a transverse, vertically placed arc in the front part of the structure. The idea is that the cradle adapts to the nomadic lifestyle. It can be tied to a sled, a tent pole, or a tree branch. It is convenient for carrying by hand, transporting by sled or boat, and the APA is very stable. If it is rolled over or dropped from the sled, it immediately resumes its rest position. Its main protection is its distinctive windshield made of reindeer suede or calf hide that is stretched between the vertical arc and the head side of the cradle. The edges of the cradle are low, that is, reaching slightly below the child, wrapped in skins and fastened with straps to the sides of the cradle. This height, together with the windshield, enables the wind, or a counterflow of cold air, to gently round the cradle from the front without bothering the child inside. With a sharper wind or snowstorm, an extra fur cover can be attached to the frame between vertical arc and the feet side of the cradle. Thus the cradle is fully covered with a small hole left for breathing. This overall resembles a child-sized version of a nomadic dwelling unit, that is, a portable conical shelter with a hole on the top, as well as of a personal sleeping bag. Thus the cradle has two windproof modes: a partially covered shelter set up against the wind direction, which is at any time ready to turn into 2, a fully protected spaceship with a windproof outer layer made of reindeer fur. Now we come to the second item, a man's utility belt. A man's utility belt is given to him at age 13 as part of the rites of passage to adulthood. Over the years, he accumulates the items for making repairs and replacements to all the other artifacts of daily life. It remains with its owner throughout his life until his death. It is the bearer of necessities for hunting, herding, weapons, and cooking-eating utensils. The most important items on the belt are knives. A knife is the most important tool that aids and enhances the human body. On the belt, a man carries up to 7 knives with determined functions. The set includes a knife for carving carcasses, a so-called making knife, used to make everything from a spoon to a boat, a healing knife, used for simple surgeries, and even a moon knife, or a knife for love. There is also a knife for war, which is placed last in the hanging set of knives, and gets in use only in the most extreme cases, since warfare is nearly non-existent in the Arctic and rare in the Subarctic. Next in importance to the set of knives is a leather-cased grindstone. From the backside there is a garland of bear's or wolf's fangs that represent a distinctive hunting mastery of the owner. On the side there is a set of multi-shaped, oblong, round, square bone buttons, that is, fixing elements of reindeer harness. There is a leather-cased bone awl used for untying the knots, especially in wet weather. Then there is a so-called portable computer that is several flat wooden sticks where the reindeer herder codes, that is carves, the necessary information related to the reindeer herd, such as the number of calves, the number of males, sick and or vaccinated animals, etc. The crown of the belt is a heavy buckle made of sheet or cast brass with a sawdust pattern. The pattern details are buttons made of brass or red copper, necessarily of the odd number. The materials of the elements of the belt also matter. Scratching a bear's fang or a copper plate with a knife yields a powder with bactericidal properties. One can mix it with water for disinfecting or put it directly onto the wound. Thus the belt is also a handy medical kit. For the male Arctic native, the belt is more than just utilitarian accessory. It doubles as a tangible ID. In other words, there is no need to say much when two men meet, because both can get to know each other simply by looking at their belts. And this brings us to the third item, a woman's needlework case. Now, sewing is the lifelong activity of an Arctic woman. The woman's role is manifest via the needle and thimble. For a girl, the personal needle case is the essential object in her rite of passage from childhood to maturity. It says she is skillful and self-sufficient. She is considered ready to get married when she has made a fur coat for herself. The proper Arctic needle is three-edged because a three-edged needle cuts thick skin. A half-sewn piece is hung above the hearth in the tent and treated with the smoke and high temperature. During this treatment, the edges of the cuts are sealed with the melted natural fat from the skin and tendon threads. Tendon threads are the only type of threads used for sewing traditional fur clothes. Thus, the sewed article becomes wind and waterproof. The shape of the thimble is different from the familiar thimble used elsewhere. A metal tube covers the entire phalange of the finger. Now, this stems from a special sewing technique. The needle rests against the finger side and not at its tip. Another meaningful artifact is the woman's bag tucha, coupled with a needle case. It contains the clothes and shoes of a whole nomadic family. Therefore, it is large. It must be sturdy and is made of leather. It is personally stylized with ornaments. It contains structural patches for every conceivable soft sewn need among the family's belongings, and structurally it has a kangaroo type of pouch for children's necessities, including materials for making diapers, first aid kits, toys, etc. This bag and needle case follow their owner throughout her entire life. Every woman decorates her things in her own way by using a visual language of patterns embodied in combinations of beads, cloth, fur, and so forth. If the mistress has golden hands, she not only remembers many ornaments, a kind of basic alphabet, but also comes up with her own. Now, for the land south of the Arctic, the subarctic culture area consists of a large zone of boreal forest that extends from tundra south to the mountains. Subarctic culture does not have defined boundaries with the area referred to in more general terms. The people of the subarctic culture depended on animals such as Dall sheep and black bear. The peoples of the subarctic culture area belong to Algic families and Iroquoian languages. They practiced mainly hunting and gathering and fishing as a means of survival. The people lived in communities of 25 to 30 people, with each group frequently moving within a defined territory. The term subarctic peoples describes a number of peoples, including the Dene, Cree, Ojibwa, Atacamaca, Innu, and Beothuk. The subarctic region consists of 5 million square kilometer zone of boreal forest extending from the Arctic tundra south to the mountains, plains, and deciduous forest in the midsection of Canada. West to east, it extends from the Bering Sea to Labrador. While parts of the 5 million square kilometer regions extend into the Arctic, 3/4 of the area lies on the Canadian Shield, Hudson Bay, and Mackenzie River lowlands. It is a land of mountain ranges, plateaus, lowlands, dotted with lakes and crossed by rivers. Aboriginal peoples of the subarctic used animals like moose, caribou, black bear, Dall sheep in the northwestern mountains, beaver, hare, marmot, and groundhog for materials and subsistence. Wolverine, otter, marten, mink, weasel, muskrat, lynx, wolf, coyote, fox, and others, together with some of the subsistence species, provided furs for trade. Muskox, bison, and wapiti were also available but less common, and fish are abundant in the rivers and lakes and include several species of whitefish, pike, lake trout, grayling, and suckers in the Arctic, salmon in the Pacific region, and to a lesser extent, Atlantic regions. Migratory waterfowl pass through the subarctic seasonally. Most peoples of the eastern subarctic belong to the Algonquin language family, while those of the western subarctic are generally part of the Athabascan family. Northern subarctic Algonquins include the Atikamekw and Innu of Quebec and Labrador, speak Cree dialects, and Algonquins to the south speak Ojibwa dialects. The Beothuk of Newfoundland spoke a language of uncertain affinity, and linguists identify more than 20 different northern Dene languages within the western subarctic, including Alaska. Most Aboriginal peoples of the subarctic were organized into bands or groups of people who spoke the same language, dialect, and were related by kinship and common traditions. Within each of the two major language families, neighboring groups often shared similar ways of life, perhaps because the western subarctic is physically more diverse than the east. There was more linguistic and cultural diversity among the Dene than the Algonquins. Dene, which means people, refers to Athabascan speakers. Dene groups in the subarctic include the Dene Nation, which consists of the Teleko, Chipewyan, Gwich'in, Dene Ta, and Decho, Satu tribes, and Tlingit, Tagish, Taltan, Tuchon, Casca, Han, Setsat, now extinct, the Sikani, Daneza, and Tatsatin. The Algonquin groups include the Ojibwa, Cree, Atikamekw, Innu, and Beothuk, now extinct. Now, as for the economy and mode of production, Aboriginal peoples of the subarctic lived by hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering wild plants. Farming was not practical within their territory. Crops successfully grown in the north today did not reach neighboring areas until after European contact. Men did most of the big game hunting, while women snared hare, fished, cut, and tried meat and processed hides. Some hunting techniques, such as drives that forced animals into temporary corrals, would involve most adult members of a band. Hunting implements included bows, arrows, a variety of ingenious traps, snares, deadfalls, and such devices as the caribou drift fence and pound. People caught fish with dip and gill nets, traps, spears, and hook and line. They dried berries in the fall or stored them in baskets and pits in the ground. In the northwest, berries were often mixed with fat and fish, or were mixed with pounded dried meat and grease to make pemmican. Women were skilled in preparing meat for drying, hide tanning, and sewing, making, cooking, and storage containers of skin, birch bark, or coiled spruce root basketry, as well as fish nets from willow-based or babiche. Since game animals were thinly distributed over vast territories in the boreal forest, or were available only locally or seasonally, population densities were modest. The entire area may have supported 60,000 people, although before the introduction of European diseases, populations could have been larger. Subarctic Native American peoples typically lived in communities of 25 to 30 people. Each group moved frequently within a well-defined territory as game supplies changed from season to season and from year to year. A group's size and the nature of its annual economic cycle were determined by the availability of local resources. The Tachoni, Dene of the Yukon Plateau, and others west of the Rocky Mountains gathered along rivers during the summer to catch and dry salmon. My crew and I assisted the Tahltan in netting large salmon on their run to spawning grounds at the confluence of the Stikine and Tahltan rivers in the summer of 1969. And these were big fish, I can tell you. And when you're in a net that stretches across the river, you might get a large number of very heavy fish, each one weighing around 100 pounds. And it's not easy to pull that thing out of the river. And women of the Tahltan tribe often went around with a stick or a rock, killing the fish on the land by pounding it on the head. And anyway, the Chippewa and Dene living north of Lake Athabasca moved to the edge of the barren grounds to follow the caribou herds. Innu spent their summers near the Atlantic, Gulf of St. Lawrence or James Bay coast, and moved inland during the winter. The Daneza hunted bison on the parkland adjacent to the Peace River and used control burning to maintain the animal's habitat. A single band rarely had exclusive access to its territory, since adjacent bands frequently shared hunting resources, especially if they faced food scarcity. Sharing resources rather than the accumulation of wealth was emphasized among individuals and communities because it provided collective insurance against shortages. However, the same band usually exploited rich sites, such as lakes or rivers, where fish could be taken regularly year after year. During the summer, when food was abundant, several local bands often resided together. Most subarctic bands did not have formal chiefs before European contact. People aligned themselves with individuals who manifested leadership and took the responsibility for specific tasks such as trading or communal hunting. Aside from the prestige and respect this brought with them, their authority did not generally extend beyond these tasks. European fur traders like Hudson Bay Company attempted to establish chiefs and to endow them with considerable power to engage as trade middlemen, thereby controlling the Native American populations with trading posts. Most adult men and women participated in decisions that affected the band. Families or individuals that did not agree with a particular decision were free to join another band or camp or to act on their own for a time. Subarctic people were noted for the value they placed on personal autonomy, as well as for the flexibility of their social organization. These characteristics helped them respond to the opportunities and limitations of their environment. Now, kinship ties among the subarctic people could be passed through the mother, that is matrilineal, or the father, that is patrilineal, or both, that is bilateral. Matrilineal kinship ties existed among Pacific Coast region Dene. Bilateral ties were characteristic of the people of the Mackenzie River region, and both bilateral and patrilineal bonds united the Algonquin speakers. Normally, people who had the regular contact used kinship terms, in part structured according to generation. That is, the eldest people become grandfather or grandmother to address and refer to one another. Kinship relations often determined membership in groups and regulated marriages. Groups west of the Mackenzie River were organized into clans, and in some cases by dual divisions called moieties, similar to those of West Coast nations. These divisions served to ensure hospitality and protection to clan members who might be visiting from other camps or bands to fulfill certain ceremonial obligations, for example, cremation and or burial of the dead and reciprocal feasts, and to regulate marriage through a requirement to marry outside of the clan. Now, since subsistence necessitated mobility, Native American peoples of the subarctic had limited material possessions. They traveled lightly and preferred to make heavier tools and implements where and when needed, rather than carry them from place to place. Success in hunting depended on accurate knowledge of animal behavior. They taught their children to be self-reliant, observant, and resourceful. The young were expected to learn the habits of game animals and to find their way through large areas of difficult terrain. Now, this was essential to survival, especially as the grizzly, black, and brown bears were endemic. Young people learned these skills by listening to long hours of practical narrative accounts and mythological tales, and by rehearsing special trapping and hunting songs and innumerable riddles. Among many groups, both boys and girls were sent on vision quests to obtain power from animal helpers or the spirits of natural places. Individuals who were successful hunters were acknowledged to have gained the respect and trust of the animals. People of the northern forest made summer moccasins, leggings, shirts, and coats of soft-tanned hides, prepared by treating the fresh hide with the animal's brains before scraping off the hair. Unique among the Pacific drainage, Dene was the short V-tailed summer slip-over caribou skin tunic, highly ornamented with dyed porcupine quills, animal teeth, and beads made from seeds, which were later became glass trade beads. This shirt was sometimes worn with leggings and with moccasins attached. More generally, subarctic aboriginal peoples wore relatively light clothing and built fires whenever they stopped. Winter sleeping robes were made of rabbit skins cut into strips, twisted, and woven together. Men made snowshoes, toboggans, canoes, sleds, and hunting implements. Survival depended on being able to travel long distances. Snowshoes were essential for winter travel. Heavy loads were transported on toboggans, and in the far northwest, sleds were pulled both by dogs and people. During the summer, people traveled with their belongings in canoes on rivers and lakes. Because of their mobile existence, northern forest peoples built shelters constructed of easily transported skin covers and of locally available materials such as bark. Dwellings varied considerably, depending on local materials and traditions, but in all areas they were designed to be heated and lit by a single fire. They did not usually accommodate more than 2 families. Among the northern Ojibwa, dwellings were ridgepole or conical lodges, also covered with birch bark. Wigwams were common among the Algonquin peoples, and many of the Arctic drainage Dene lived in conical shelters covered with hides, similar to the teepee, which was the typical dwelling of Plains people. Among the Gwich'in and Han of the Yukon, as well as in northern Alaska, the conical tent was replaced by a domed or hemispherical one. Double lean-to structures covered with hides and brush were used in the Arctic, that is, Mackenzie region, and the northwestern mountains and plateau regions. At fishing camps in the Cordillera, there were unchinked smoke houses that resembled roughly built log cabins. To provide added warmth in winter dwellings, the hair was left on the hide coverings of conical and domed tents that, although bulky, were nevertheless portable. And in the Ice Mountain Archaeological Expedition, we converted 2 of the fish houses of this nature into shelters in which we pitched our tents. At any rate, some Dene of the Mackenzie district in Cordillera, as well as the eastern subarctic peoples, wintered in conical log structures chinked with moss and partially covered with dirt and snow. The Han near Dawson and many Alaskan groups built rectangular pit houses that were heavily banked with turf to withstand the cold. Far to the south in British Columbia, groups such as the Chilcotin made pit houses similar to those used by the peoples of the plateau. And considerable effort was taken to cache food and equipment not needed for the season. Specially prepared pits, strong cribbed and conical structures, cairns or racks and platforms in trees were used for storage. And that brings us finally to the ideology of these people. Myths and legends describe a time when animals had great power and could assume human form. Many subarctic peoples told stories about a culture hero, the first person to gain special powers. For them, power and knowledge were one, and a powerful individual was one who knows something. The culture hero demonstrated the personal knowledge and self-reliance recognized as important survival skills and could outwit individuals with knowledge of evil medicine. They also possessed the ability to overcome dangerous animals and thus made the world a safer place in which humans could live. The Algonquin culture hero and trickster figures are known as Nanabozo and Wisakabjak. The Dene culture hero goes by many names, but is often associated with migratory winter birds and the sun, both of which are seen to fly through the heavens. Beliefs about the interdependence of people and nature embodied in myth helped subarctic Aboriginal peoples interpret their environment. Spiritual leaders were people who used their powers for the benefit of others, though to some people they sometimes used their power for evil. Many Algonquins, these shamans or medicine people, conducted the shaking tent ceremony, in which distant spirits of people or animals were conjured for curing and prophecy in a special teepee. Elsewhere, shamans performed under a blanket or dressed in a special manner, signifying their importance within the native community. Western Dene medicine men and women charged high prices for their services and asserted prerogatives or took liberties among their people, meaning many of them were feared as well as respected. Among the Innu, certain men and women predicted hunting trails by scapulomancy, a form of divination that interpreted the pattern of cracks on a caribou shoulder blade heated by fire. The Danizah of the Peace River region in the west had prophets called dreamers. These people had experienced death and flown like swans to a spirit land beyond the sky. They were healers and leaders in religious dances based on songs they brought back from their journeys to heaven. Like many other subarctic peoples, they sang to the accompaniment of single-headed hand drums. Most people, however, had some degree of medicine power obtained from childhood vision quests. In addition, there was a body of beliefs and practices, taboos, prescriptions, and minor rituals to separate from shamanism, divination, and curing. Among these customs were the special observances made prior to and after killing animals. And that brings us to the conclusion of this lecture in support of the chapter on the far north. I'm going to continue with another chapter on the boreal forest and inland regions of the far north in the next lecture. And we'll also do some work on the northwest coast. And that's it for today.